Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tom Niziol, winter weather expert here at the Weather Channel, and we're on Google Hangout today to discuss one of our newest ventures, which is the naming of winter storms. This won't be our only topic of discussion today. We're also open for lots of questions on how this winter is going to turn out. With me today are a number of specialists from the Weather Channel. They will include Bryan Norcross, who is our Senior Executive Director of Weather Content at the Weather Channel, Stu Ostro, who's our Senior Director of Weather Communications, and Jon Erdman, a Senior Meteorologist who also is very active in everything that you see on weather.com. So back to our main topic, naming winter storms. This is an effort that we've been working on for quite a while here at the Weather Channel. And the goal of this effort was really to increase the awareness of our users and get you all involved with winter weather on a national scale. The object here is to have you prepared for these impacts when they move across the nation. This is especially true for travelers, in particular travelers who are not only flying from one destination to another, but those who are on our major highways. It's going to be an interesting season, and again, we'll have answers to your questions about winter weather as well. But I think one of the first questions that came up here, and this is a very good question from Lisa. Lisa's question, where did you get the inspiration for storm names? And can you address any at this point? So I'm going to hand this over to our communications specialist here, to Bryan Norcross. Bryan, where did we get the inspiration for storm names?
Tom, you think the question is about the nature of the names, the particular names that we chose?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah, I think that's probably it. So what the process was is that we asked for contributions from people here at the Weather Channel on our meteorology and producing team, and we got a whole bunch of ideas that came in, all the way from just a list of good names. We looked at the most popular names of the 20th century and the most popular names of the last decade and all kinds of things. And then the idea surfaced of going the Greek and Roman route to be distinctively different from any hurricane names or tropical storm names that would have been used. And from that, we started with that and then filled in the slots because there are not good names that people can remember or even spell or pronounce for all of those letters. So that's how we ended up with the set of names. It was kind of an evolutionary process.
And I might add that to the more general question of just using the names as a whole for winter storms, one of the sources of our idea and one of the things that convinced me that it's something we ought to do is Twitter hashtags. And the fact that nowadays storms are getting named anyway via that medium, and if they're going to be given a hashtag, we might as well go through with this sort of a plan.
Yeah, I just wanted to throw in that Twitter hashtags. If you're active on Twitter, you've seen these for the last several years. In fact, my first memory of it was the Snowmageddon storm several winters ago in the East Coast. That hashtag took off like wildfire. So the naming is already occurring in social media, so we're just taking that to another step.
Yeah, and I think we formalize it by going with a list of names that we have here. It's great for everyone because we have the ability then to look at our names in an alphabetical sense. And for those who are following winter storms across the country, you literally can count your storms from one to another, the A, B, C, D, and E storms as we move along through the year. So that kind of sums up kind of the inspiration that we've had behind naming these storms. And I think we'll wait for another question here and see if there's anyone else who has questions about the whole concept of the storm naming process. Let's take a look at what we have coming up here.
Tom, let me just add one thing since we're waiting here and to talk about the inspiration is that we all know, and everybody that follows weather knows, that when a storm, a tropical system gets named, that raises awareness of it. And in this modern era of people that really live on Facebook or on their iPod or whatever they live on, that is different from the mainstream media that we used to all attach ourselves to, that the more awareness we can give people minimizes the number of people that are surprised and are stranded on the road or some other bad effect to them just because they weren't aware. So that process was, I think, important in our discussion. And the other reality is the European reality where they've been naming storms forever. And if you read the newspapers during a big winter event in Europe, you'll see the names used regularly, and you hear them on the media in Europe because people have just become used to attaching names to storms. So in some ways, we're actually kind of late to the game here, but it just makes so much sense from a communications point of view, and that's why it's being adopted. And that's why, as John said, the Twitterverse uses it, because it's a compact way for people to know what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's never ceased to amaze me the difference in the amount of attention that a system receives if it's designated not even necessarily a tropical storm with a human name, but even a tropical depression with a number, versus one which might have some characteristics of a tropical cyclone, but it isn't quite enough to get a number or name. You could have a big area thunderstorm sitting right off, say, the coast of Florida, and it could come on shore, produce a lot of heavy rain, but if it doesn't have a number or name, it just doesn't get the kind of attention, whereas instantly, as soon as the National Hurricane Center designates it as something, everybody pays attention to it.
Yeah, we had that happen just a year before last, right? Kind of last year, 2011. Exactly what Stu just said. And it was clamoring for naming it because it did damage, although it didn't meet the criteria.
Yeah, in fact, it was, now that I think of it, it was almost exactly a year ago today. It was about a year ago this week, maybe October 8th or 9th, that a system spun up, caused some wind damage on the east coast of Florida, and it had some tropical characteristics, but it didn't get a name.
And I also found it fascinating, not too surprising as well, that the NBC news poll that was out the other day as to whether you think it's a good idea to name winter storms came back with a tremendous positive reaction. I believe 75 or 76% of the voters came in with a yes for naming storms. So we know the user, the viewer out there, really is looking forward to this, and I think it's going to be a very valuable process. We've got another question here. This is an interesting one now, just to kind of segue into the winter season so far. I like this. This is coming from a middle school student, Anders Christensen, and he's asking why winter is coming so early. So, you know, us meteorologists have been watching this very carefully, and we saw a very quick change in the weather pattern here over the past week or so. Do a little meteorology here. We had a big ridge build on the west coast of North America, and that prompted what we call a trough pattern down across the Great Lakes and into the Northeast. That opened the floodgates for some pretty cold air up in northern Canada to slide south right through the northern plains, down through Denver. You all saw the temperature drop there just after the presidential debate. And northwestern Minnesota. So Matt's question about winter coming so early, October is a very changeable month. We're going from one season to the next. And in that changeable month, we can be very quiet some years, and then all of a sudden the atmosphere starts to undulate and change as it's heading toward winter, and we get these massive cold outbreaks. And so we did get our first taste of winter, maybe a little earlier for this type of snow, this amount of snow up in the northern plains, but not all that out of the question for, again, this time of the year going into the October time frame. Anybody else?
I was just going to say we had a meteorological debate this morning amongst us meteorologists whether we should really be calling this a true Arctic air mass coming down, and it really is, because if you trace the origin of the cold air in the lower to middle part of the atmosphere and the high pressure system associated with it, it's coming straight down from the Arctic, from northernmost Canada and the Arctic Ocean. It's not uncommon to see some pretty chilly air this time of year. Once you get in October, anything is fair game, although we looked at some of the record low temperatures where the differences from average are going to be the greatest. For example, Amarillo, Texas, temperature may come close to about as low a temperature as we've seen this early in the season in that part of the country.
By the way, just to put in a plug for something we've just put on weather.com today, we actually have an interactive map. If you've always asked yourselves what typically is the time of year where we start seeing the first snow of the season, if you go to our main homepage, weather.com, the very first tab, you click on that image of the lady in Fargo, North Dakota, experiencing their first snow. You pull up an interactive map, and you can click on your location and find out when that average date is. Now, of course, some years it comes much earlier, like this year in parts of the upper Midwest. and some years it's much later. But it gives you kind of a climatological feel of when you can expect your average first season snow. It's on weather.com right now.
Yeah, thanks, John. I was looking at that earlier today. It's a great page to go to, very interactive, and I had a lot of fun going through that as well. Hey, we have another question here. This is an interesting one as well, and it kind of connects everything that's been going on over the year to what we might expect this winter. And the question is, will the drought impact winter conditions? And it's an excellent question. I'm going to defer over to probably to Stu about this as well. He's been following the drought a lot here over the past couple of months. And Stu, would you like to start with this one?
Of course, you would call on me, Tom, for that question. That is a good question. I don't know whether the drought would necessarily affect the winter pattern, but that isn't to say that it won't either. If the same kind of atmospheric pattern which helped produce the extended periods of dry weather were to continue, then that would result in a particular outcome with the winter precipitation, at least if not temperatures. In other words, if the jet stream flow is such that what was causing the dry weather throughout a good chunk this year so far were to continue, then you'd expect to see below average precipitation across a good chunk of the western, central, and to east central U.S., which also would affect the amount of snowfall that would occur. Ultimately, it's going to depend on the configuration of that jet stream, and if it were to set up in a different place, then we'd have a wet, snowy pattern or wet, snowy, rainy pattern. We just don't know exactly how that's going to shake out, but the fact that the dry pattern has been so persistent so far this year would make us wonder whether that might continue on for, well, looks like it's going to continue for at least a while, and then the big question will be what happens during the heart of the winter, not only for worsening of the drought and for below average precipitation there, but also what it would mean for winter storms and snowfall and temperatures in places such as Chicago and the Northeast, and that depends on a variety of complex factors from the Pacific all the way up to Greenland.
But Stu, as we look at the drought and how it affects summer weather, the fact that the land is drier actually makes it hotter, right? And we would not think you would have that kind of a feedback situation in the winter. I think the main point is that the drought is caused by unusual high amplitude pattern where you have an unusually stuck extreme weather pattern. And we've seen this kind of high amplitude pattern really for the past 10 or 15 years, that the jet stream has just been high amplitude a lot, and that means extremes. It means extremely warm or extremely cold. And back to the original question there, Tom, we had an outbreak that was on the extremely chilly side for the first part of October, and it's just part of other places have been extremely warm, but the populated part of the eastern part of the United States just happened, midwestern part of the United States just happened to get the cold this time.
Yeah, one more point relative to the drought, though. We are going to need a big change in the pattern and a lot of precipitation just over and over and over again across a large area to really make a significant dent in the drought. The drought is just so severe and so widespread, so widespread that it would take something like that. And this is the time of year when you can get that, not only more widespread precipitation as opposed to the summer when oftentimes it's just localized thunderstorms, but also, like Bryan mentioned, during the summer you have the sun's radiation coming down, which heats the ground, boosts the temperatures even further, which then dry out the soil even more. You have that feedback. In the winter, the air is colder, the sun angle is lower, so you also don't evaporate as much moisture. So we're coming into the time of year when the opportunity is there to make a dent in the drought. But if we don't get it, before you know it, it'll be spring and summer again, and then we're into a severe multi-year drought, and it would just start getting worse again.
Yeah, and speaking of going into the winter, we've seen these little pattern changes here over the past several days where we've had this cold outbreak come down across the northern and central part of the U.S. It's fascinating. We look at the seasonal outlook right now, and I'll refer to the October-November timeframe. It's suggesting on average, in particular for temperature, higher than average, a better chance for above normal temperatures across the northern tier of the country. And indeed, over that entire 3-month period, we're probably going to see something like that. But look what happened just the other day, and what's going to continue, by the way, into next week. Our 6 to 10 day outlook for the Northeast, at least, is going to be somewhat colder than normal. And those conditions you oftentimes will find in an overall pattern that is milder. Again, October is a very changeable month. We've even had some input from what we'll call tropical energy well out in the Pacific that is downstream, changing the weather pattern over North America. And that contributes to these undulations and these changes that you see in the weather pattern over, a 6 to 10 or 8 to 14 day period. So it's going to be interesting as we head into the winter, and we're already watching some little tweaks by Mother Nature here that have come over the last several days and will be coming into next week. We're going to go back to another question here, and this is regarding our storm naming. I think it's an excellent question coming from Daniel. Daniel's got a question here, the specific criteria for when we do and don't name storms. And this is in reference to something like a Saffir-Simpson scale. And again, I'm going to go back to Bryan for this, for an overall review of our criteria and how we go through this whole process to actually name a storm. Bryan?
Sure. So the key word in this is the storm going to be impactful? It's really a subjective judgment based on our forecast of the senior meteorologists, the team of senior meteorologists here at the Weather Channel. So the key factors are if it meets these criteria, we would consider naming it. First of all, that significant impacts look like they would occur within the next 3 days. So we wouldn't go generally out beyond 3 days because we want to be more certain that it is indeed going to happen. That the system, as forecast, would likely cause a significant disruption in travel, as Tom mentioned, air travel and travel on the road. So significant disruption to people's lives. And third, that it would cause life-threatening conditions either because of snow or ice or cold. In other words, it would be extreme in some fashion. So, and the more extreme it is, the more that we might look at it to evaluate the possibility of naming it. So we're kind of building this box, and we're looking inside a set of guidelines and considerations and saying, does our forecast, as we look ahead to the system, fit inside those considerations? So we're not going to name every storm that comes along. We're not going to name it if it's a little inconvenience, but significant disruption to life and safety, I think, would be the way to look at our naming process and our naming criteria.
And just the critical nature, the huge envelope of different situations that can evolve in a winter storm makes quantitatively trying to set one number to make a decision almost impossible to do. We've realized that from the beginning of this whole project. This is why the human is such an important ingredient in going through the decision-making process for what we'll term, is a big term called societal impact, how it is going to impact the society overall. I mean, we can look at some objective criteria. Of course, we're dealing with winter storms, so we're looking at snowfall, ice accumulation, that combination of snow or ice and wind. We all know what that combination can produce, not only low visibilities for travel, but bringing down power lines, certainly with ice and snow accumulations. What about the temperature? The temperature, if you're dealing with a winter storm and the temperature is 30 degrees outside and you're stranded in the vehicle, that may not be as much of a factor as if the temperature is 5 below zero and you're stranded in a storm which you're going to be in your vehicle for several hours. These are all the types of parameters that we have to look at and we have to consider before we look at that impact and then go out to name a storm. So it is, as much as we'd love to be able to sit there and just, run through a little calculator with 1, 2, 3, 4 and come up with a number there and say, therefore we're naming, the nature of winter weather itself and moving across the country is so dynamic that it is very, very difficult to try to put one number on that. You all know yourselves, and Stu, just one other quick point here, that oftentimes that winter storm that is affecting the East Coast today wasn't even apparent on a weather map 3 days previous to this. the atmosphere works with a lot of energy in the wintertime, and it's a very subtle features that come together to produce these storms, and that's another reason why we only go about 72 hours out in even considering the decision to name. Stu?
Yeah, I was just going to add that even though ultimately it is going to be a human subjective judgment made by a committee of meteorologists here, we are going to be as objective as possible, make the criteria as objective as possible in terms of snowfall, and in particular the amount of snowfall relative to the geography and how well prepared a particular area is. It isn't going to be the same for Minnesota as it would be for Atlanta. The amount of ice and potential for trees and power lines down, that sort of thing. Wind, which could create blizzard conditions or create power outages, that sort of thing. Temperatures, is there going to be a severe Arctic blast accompanying it, as well as the amount of population affected. And while we can't put it all together with one magic number, we are going to be looking at these sorts of parameters as objectively as possible.
Let me just add one thing too, just for comparison. People have said, "Is there anything like this?" And there is actually something kind of like it, and it's what the folks at the National Hurricane Center go through when they're assigning a percentage to whether they think a system is going to develop out in the tropics. And what they do is they have a set of guidelines to follow, and they look at the meteorology of it, and they look at the satellite and the models and everything, and then they assign a number subjectively that based on their experience, that's what they think the percentage likelihood of development is. Then they go back and verify it after the fact to see if their odds are correct. But the process is really subjective. And all of us that have forecast the weather know that forecasting has a significant subjective element to it, that in your judgment, this is the representative forecast of what is going to happen for the future. So there are a number of things that are already going on that fit the mold of what we're doing here. And what we're doing is really, as John said earlier, for the communications process. It doesn't have anything to do with the forecast. We're going to make the same forecast for snowfall. We'll still do the watches and advisories and warnings from the National Weather Service, just like we always have. All of that will be the same. It's really the communications process that we hope is enhanced by this naming that, as John said, is already really going on. Tom?
Yeah, just punctuate what Bryan said, make sure everybody knows that. It's an important point that we will still be communicating all the official watches and warnings from the National Weather Service. And also, in regard to the designation of tropical systems, there's a human element of that too. Meteorologists can look at all the same data, and still there are times where it's not entirely clear whether something has enough tropical characteristics to be called a tropical depression or storm, or whether it's of hurricane intensity. So there's even an analogy with the naming of tropical systems in that respect too.
And I'm sure there will be just like there's a debate there's going to be a debate with this. And what we're going to do is put out our criteria, our considerations and guidelines, so that everybody that to participate can participate and look at the forecasts and make their judgment on whether something should be named or not. Tom, I've got to run. It's been a pleasure, everybody watching. Thanks very much, and I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, thank you, Bryan. We appreciate your comments and your participation. We do have another question here, and that question that comes in, could this become confusing since the National Weather Service isn't naming storms? I think we've already referred to the fact that, and we will continue to do this, the National Weather Service is a close partner with the Weather Channel, with the media, and the National Weather Service is the agency that is responsible for warnings and watches for winter storms. It's imperative that we continue to communicate that information here at the Weather Channel. The National Weather Service's warnings are the most important tool to notify their users on a very local scale, over 100 offices that exist across the United States that deal with local scale weather, and we are going to continue to do our role in getting that information on the Weather Channel and out to the public as we have been. So from that point of view, I think we're contributing to that. The naming of the winter storms is raising awareness, and once we raise that awareness for the public, I think they will benefit from that as well. Stu or John?
Yeah, and we all here at the Weather Channel, as are all meteorologists, are very passionate about providing the best information possible to people, whether it be helping to plan their day or in an extreme event, saving lives, whether it be hurricanes, tornadoes, winter storms. And that's what we hope to do here, is provide information. It's just in a different form, but provide information toward that goal.
Yeah, and we've already, oh, go ahead, John.
Just to add on, again, we will communicate winter weather risk for any system as we've done in our history going forward. This is merely an attempt to draw attention to the high impact events. But we'll continue to highlight even those events that only produce maybe an inch or two of snowfall with our, with our regular forecast products on air and online. That will not change. We're simply calling attention to some of the highest impact events by attaching a name. But if you're expecting an inch of snow, which of course can lead to slippery roads in the middle of January, we may not, if we don't name that storm, that doesn't mean we're not covering. We are still covering it as we have on air and online. That part never changes. And
there have been, and I can guarantee you there will continue to be, those events where just all of a sudden at 6 o'clock in the morning, a little bit of freezing drizzle breaks out in a metropolitan area. Was it last year? I think we saw that in, was it St. Louis, John and Tom?
Yeah, that's right.
Where all of a sudden there are very hazardous driving conditions with barely even any measurable precipitation, which we would not have named that sort of storm in advance. Or in Cleveland, there was that lake effect snow ban, which right during rush hour pivoted in and caused disruption. So there are all these different scales of events, and we aren't going to, and we can't possibly name all of them, but the big scale blockbuster snowstorms, blizzards, ice storms that we can see coming with confidence anywhere from a day to 3 days in advance are the sorts of things that we'll be able to assign these names to.
Yeah, and I think the Weather Channel has positioned itself through its technology, through its communications across all of these platforms, and its expertise to be able to relay this type of information on a national scale. Once again, if I refer back to the National Weather Service model of the local offices, which do a tremendous job on that scale to work with their residents in those areas down to a county and lower scale of the intensity of the impacts that those storms will provide, we can, on a national scale, provide information and updates and awareness for the traveler. As an example, if this storm develops in Denver and is going to be cutting across Chicago and into the Northeast, once it attains that name, the storm gets hashtagged on some of our social media, we can then follow that storm, and so can the user right across the country. And I think that's a unique quality of the Weather Channel, to be able to provide that information on a national scale.
Yeah, and we also went back and looked at last year's storms during the winter, and it shook out pretty well, where there were about 7 or 8 that if we were doing that this year, we would have had the confidence to name in advance. There were a couple of borderline ones that were a little trickier. This will be a learning process as we go along, but it was interesting the way we ended up with about 7 or 8, I think we would agree upon. And to use the analogy with hurricane season, in a fairly quiet year, we might have 7 or 8 or 10 storms. Very active one, like this year we've had 14, had 19, even 28 in 2005. I don't know that we'll ever have a winter with 28 storms of the kind that we would give a name to, but as we calibrate this, it made sense that with last winter not being a particularly snowy one, there might have only been about 7, whereas in a more active winter there would be more. Although, if you look back to the ferocious winters of 2009-10 and 2010-11, a lot of what those winters are remembered for came in just a small handful of blockbuster storm, so it wouldn't necessarily increase the total number.
Yeah, and referring to blockbuster storms versus those that may not be on that big a scale, just the other day, the event that affected portions of northeastern North Dakota and northwestern Minnesota, that's a good example of a storm that had significant impact. The warnings that were issued by the National Weather Service were heeded. There was a lot of impact to those communities that were up in that area, but the storm wasn't quite on a scale of impact to affect a portion of the United States that we would end up naming. This is a storm that we considered, but it's a good example of just because we don't name a storm doesn't mean for those areas affected by it, they will not be impacted. This is it's a work in progress. We have had tremendous positive response from our users and our viewers so far. Our meteorologists are all excited to look at the first event, which I think is going to be Athena, if I'm not mistaken, our first named event when it finally does come to fruition. And you know, we really want everybody to work along with us on this. I think it can be a very interesting process. I think you'll enjoy it through the winter. Be interesting to hashtag this and follow these storms. The Weather Channel is going to continue to provide this type of support, and we hope that you'll continue to stay tuned. Go to weather.com on our social media for the updates as we work into the winter. Gentlemen, I want to thank you for working with us today and contributing to this discussion that we've had. I think it's been an excellent Google Hangout, and I hope this will be the first of many more we'll have for this winter. Thank you very much.